Welcome back to Constitutional Live with David Barton and Rick Green. This is sort of part 2 on Article 1, Section 8. So we're going to get a little bit further into some of those clauses. We hit a couple of the most abused clauses, Commerce Clause, General Welfare Clause. There's a lot of clauses. What are some of the other clauses in the Constitution we need to be aware of?
You know, clauses in the Constitution are really good because they tell us generally what we're about to learn or generally what the thing is. And
almost like a chapter heading for that particular topic.
If you say, oh, this guy's a U.S. Senator, well, now you know what he does.
Yeah.
You know something about him, and therefore you know how to talk to him about what he does. Or this guy's a pastor, or this guy's a scientist who invented whatever. Once you get a title to something, you now have some area where you can work. And so I went through and wrote down some of the names of the clauses in the Constitution, because just by naming the clause, as it's already named, these are common clause names, you get an idea of what's coming. So, for example, the Advice and Consent Clause. Well, that's going to deal with the powers of the Senate related to the President. He gets to advise and consent on nominees. You have the Commerce Clause. You talk some about that with loopholes. You have the Establishment Clause, which is going to come up in the Bill of Rights. There's the Establishment Clause, and there's the Free Exercise Clause in the Bill of Rights. You have the Exceptions Clause, which is going to be Article 3, which is going to tell you what you can take away from the courts. If you want something accepted from them, not accepted, not ACC, but EX, you can do everything except this.
Basically set aside from them,
I'm not, you cannot do this. That's an exception.
Yeah.
Then the Exceptions Clause. You have the Full Faith and Credit Clause, which is how come we accept contracts back and forth between states. So a contract you make in Montana is going to be valid in Mississippi or somewhere else in most cases. The General Welfare Clause.
We got to cover that again, man.
But it's good for us to know what it really means, so that when we hear that, we can say, whoa, time out, you guys are off base here. That's not what it means.
And some of these, so some of these are the actual language of
this
the
is the actual language.
Others are descriptions of that particular clause. Okay.
That's right. So the Necessary and Proper Clause.
That's actual language.
That's actual language.
We're going to hit that one when we go back to Philly, too.
The Origination Clause, which this is one of the constitutional arms of self-defense that the Founding Fathers through the Constitution gave to Congress, that puts a lot of cramp on the other two branches when they get out, but nobody uses it anymore. But the Origination Clause is really good stuff. The Supremacy Clause, which we're going to get to in Article 6 of the Constitution. The Take Care Clause, that's Article 2, where the President is supposed to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. That's actual constitutional
so that's actual language.
The Takings Clause, well, that's the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution. That is another one of those language clauses. The Treaty Clause, we have the Free Exercise Clause, the Free Speech Clause, the Free Press Clause, the Free Assembly Clause, the Petition Clause, the Self-Incrimination Clause, the Impeachment Clauses, the Just Compensation Clause. These are really simple titles, and once you learn the Constitution, somebody uses one of those titles, you go, I know exactly what they're talking about. And that's what we're going to get some more of in this lesson.
So we're going to jump back in for more of the details out of Article 1, Section 8, and we're going to get some questions from the class when we join them back at Independence Hall. So for us to do our job, we got to know what's in there. We got to know what these enumerated powers are. So Commerce Clause is one that has been obviously a loophole they've gone through. General Welfare is one that they've gone through. I want to actually give you a small example. This is one that you wouldn't, it's not a big loophole, but it really helps me to see just how far Congress has gone from plain language. Have you ever heard anybody say the Constitution is too hard to understand, the language is just too old, we just can't read it? Let's just look at the plain language of the Constitution on a particular issue. It's going to be the third, I think the fourth from the top on page 14. If you'll jump over there with me, this is after post office and post roads and counterfeiting and that sort of thing. It's the fourth from the top, and I'm actually going to ask for a volunteer. I want to get somebody to read this language, fourth paragraph from the top that talks about to promote the progress. Who wants to be my volunteer tonight and stand up and read this clause for me?
To promote the progress of science and useful arts.
Stop! Because there's a period there, right?
There is.
Comma. No.
Oh, I'm sorry. There's no period there. Go ahead. I can't imagine why I would have thought there was a period there. We'll come back to that. Go ahead.
By securing for limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries.
Interesting. So no period. Now, if there was a period there, you could probably say Congress can do whatever it wants to promote the progress of science and useful arts. It's a period. These guys said Congress gets to decide how they want to promote the progress of science. The only way they're limited in that is they have to come home and answer to us, right? We may not like them doing certain things. We can vote them out if that's the case. But it's the power if there's a period there. No period there. So after that comma, it actually tells us the only constitutional way that Congress can promote the progress of science and useful arts. What are we talking about here? Copyrights, patents, trademarks, right? We're talking about protecting your property. We're talking about the best way to promote the progress of science and useful arts is to protect the system, the general welfare. We're back to that whole concept. Protect the system. Provide the individual with a legal system that allows them to own their property and protect it and profit from it. That's all they're talking about here. But today, man, it's like we've got a period there because they're spending money promoting the progress of science and useful arts. They're spending $30 billion over here and $30 billion over there on science, on Big Bird and Ernie and Elmo, on Sesame Street and NPR and all these things because they say they're promoting the progress of science and useful arts. And I'm just confused because I don't understand how they have the power to do it in the first place. It doesn't tell them they can do it. It says that the only thing they can do is protect the invention. And there's a reason these guys did that. I mean, you had one of the greatest inventors in American history sitting here, Benjamin Franklin, and he didn't say, hey, let's use the government to go invent things and fund science and all that. They said not to do that. Why? Because they understood the basic concept that a bureaucrat, a government, will not make better decisions than individuals about what is a useful art, about what is a good investment in terms of science. They understood from real life that government couldn't decide better than individuals. In fact, I think Congressman Bob McEwen probably has the best example I've ever heard. He said, if I take $100 and I'm going to go buy me something, I'm going to be concerned about two things. Price, because it's my money, right? And quality, because I'm going to use it. I'm going to be the one actually using that thing. So those two things are very important to me. But if I'm going to go out and I'm going to buy something, what's your name, ma'am? Mary? Okay, Mary, let's say I'm going to go buy something for you, and I'm going to spend that same $100. Is price still important to me? Yeah, it's still my money, right? Is quality as important to me? Sorry, Mary, you're going to use it, not me. So that's a little bit important because I don't want Mary to think I'm a total jerk, but I'm not going to be quite as worried if I'm not the one using it. But now here's the kicker. What happens if, tell me your name again? Ruth Ann. Do you know Mary? Okay, good. Ruth Ann, I gotta run right after we're done with the class. I'm flying back home, and I don't have time to go buy. If I give you $100, will you go buy Mary something for me? Okay, please don't come ask me for $100 after this, because I'm not giving it to you. But it's just an example. We're make-believing here. All right, so let's say she's gonna go out and spend $100 on Mary for me, with my money. Is price important to her? No, it's my money. Is quality important to her? No, she doesn't know Mary, and she doesn't ever gonna talk to Mary again. Price, friends, every government transaction fits that model right there. Government takes money from one to spend on someone else, so price and quality never matter. That's why you don't want government doing anything outside its jurisdiction. It's if you want to use the phrase necessary evil, I'm not anti-government. You need government to do certain things. Take the military. We're going to see a ton of things here in Article 1, Section 8. I want to be the biggest, baddest nation on the planet, right? I want peace through strength. So if they have to spend trillions of dollars to do that, that's okay because it's a proper function of government. It's in the proper jurisdiction of what they're supposed to do. Sometimes we think of limited government as small amount of money. It's not. Limited government means limited jurisdictions. It means not allowing the government to spend even $1 outside of the jurisdiction they're supposed to be in. So if they're spending money on the military, and that's why you're going to end up with $400 hammers, because of this model right here, we try to keep it as, limited. We use sunlight to be the best disinfectant. You try to make it the best you can, but you're going to have things like that. But if they get outside their jurisdiction, it's going to be even worse. Because if government is taking my money to spend on science or the arts, some bureaucrat's going to think that they can decide better than me what I would support. That's why you end up with corruption. So how you get a Solandra, that's how you get wasted money. That's how you get money going into science that doesn't pay. Let me give you an example of this. How many of y'all enjoy going out and looking at Christmas lights? Anybody here like looking at Christmas lights? I hate looking at Christmas lights. I don't know why. I don't know why you people like to do that. I mean, my wife makes me go every year. The same lights, folks. Nothing changes. You're looking at the same ones you saw last year. Anyway, all right. But that's your freedom to do that. So you'd be sure. If you had gone to Washington, D.C. to look at the Christmas displays, not this last Christmas, but the Christmas before that. Let's say you went to the Smithsonian. Smithsonian had a Christmas display up. And the Christmas display for the Smithsonian that year you would have had the opportunity to see Jesus Christ on the cross covered in ants. You would have been able to see a poster of Ellen DeGeneres holding her breast, and beside that one you would have seen some posters of what even the Smithsonian said was homoerotic art, all paid for by you, paid for by me, paid for with our tax dollars because some bureaucrat somewhere decided that was a useful art. $6 million went to the group that put that display on. Now, I don't know about you, but I wouldn't call that a useful art. But even if we're talking about the Sistine Chapel, even if we're talking about just an incredible work of art, it is not government's role to fund that or promote the progress of that, except for protecting the inventor, protecting the author, protecting the creator. That's government's role. And probably the best example of this, think about science. Think about stem cells. Okay? You got two kinds of stem cell research, right? You got adult stem cell research, you got embryonic stem cell research. Which one is getting the private money, the venture capital money? Adult or embryonic?
Adult.
Adult. Why?
Because it works.
Because it works. Exactly right. It works. So everybody's going, well, I'm not going to invest in embryonic. They haven't found a single cure. They're at zero. Adult stem cell research is now over 100. On my slide, actually, there is old. Over 100 different amazing cures. I mean, science is amazing. It's phenomenal what they've been able to do with these adult stem cells. So all the private money's going over there. Where's the embryonic stem cell research getting its money? Herein lies the problem. Because, yeah, from us, through government. That's exactly right. You got that exactly right. We're paying for it through government. I mean, my own state of Texas, I forget the number. What's it say on there? 41 million. New York, 600 million. California, 3 billion. Government's funding science that doesn't work because what's happened is politics enters into the equation. Just like the corruption. You know what happens? If I'm controlling all that money as a bureaucrat or a politician, the money's going to end up going to friends of mine, right? That's just the nature of man. That's what ends up happening. It's a bad deal, folks, and there's only one way to stop it. You and I have to read the Constitution, and you show me in the plain language right there where Congress has any power to spend 1 penny on the progress of science and useful arts. They don't. Now, if it took money to run the U.S. Patent and Copyright Office or Trademark Office, I can understand, but it doesn't. That's the only department that actually turns a profit, right? Because it's providing a very good service to the market. But look at the plain language. It's very clear we went wrong because we simply didn't read the language and hold our members of Congress accountable. If we do that, we could get them back in their proper place. I'm going to skip a couple of things here and get ready to close us out on Article 1, Section 8. But please take a note of that one you see on the screen right there. To constitute tribunals inferior to the Supreme Court. We're going to come back to that when we get over into Article 3. So here's a power of Congress that has to do with the courts. We'll talk about that later. To define and punish piracies and felonies committed on the high seas and offenses against the laws of nation. To declare war. Here's 3 different things. To declare war, grant letters of marque and reprisal, and make rules concerning captures on land and water. Just a quick point on to declare war. How does it say we'll declare war? Doesn't say. It's exactly right. There's no description. There's no special piece of paper. There's no specific. Congress declares war any way they want, including spending the money on that war. So a lot of my dear friends say we're fighting undeclared wars. I disagree. When Congress passes a resolution that says, Mr. President, go prosecute this war on terror, they have declared war. When they stand on the Capitol steps and sing America the Beautiful and hand that resolution, they've declared war. Every time they spend money on the war, they're declaring war. You know how they undeclare the war? They stop spending the money. And they've got the power of the purse. They can do that and say, we're going to give you enough to bring the troops home. That's it. So declare war is, I think, gets distorted in our minds today. We try to complicate it. When you look at the Constitution itself, it's not complicated. They have the power to declare war. They can do it any way they want. Last thing on that section, grant letters of marque and reprisal. That might sound weird to us today. I want you to try to put yourself in these shoes, in these chairs, if you will. When they did the Constitution, they were in the middle of the first war on radical Islam. That was happening. Started in 1784. First war on terror was a 32-year war. I didn't know that. I'll just tell you, I didn't remember anything I learned in school about this. I was actually sitting on a radio program, and David Barton says to me, we're talking about there was a Muslim that was elected to Congress out of Minnesota, and he got sworn in on the Koran. I don't know if y'all remember the picture. And it was Thomas Jefferson's Koran. Jefferson had a beautiful copy of the Koran, big 2-volume set. And so Congressman Ellison was sworn in on the Koran. We were getting calls, people saying, well, can he do that? He can't do that, can he? We said, no, of course he can. It's his choice. Not sure it's a good idea when we're at war with radical Islam, but hey, if he wants to do it, that's his choice. But the second question was, Thomas Jefferson had a Quran? Why did Jefferson, was Jefferson Muslim? And everybody was calling in and asking us. So David's going to answer the question on the air, and he looks over at me and he says, well, Rick, of course this war we're in now is not our first war on terror. So we're live on the air. I said, no, David, of course not. Why don't you tell us about that first war on terror? I didn't have a clue what the man was talking about, all right? Now, you're probably all better students than me, and you remember the Barbary Powers Wars and the 4 Muslim states. What happened was you had these extremists that were capturing our merchant ships and ransoming our sailors back to us or killing them because they believed they had a spiritual reward for doing that. Well, Jefferson over here is actually, this starts in 84, so this is before they even came back for the Constitution. And when I point to him, that was the Declaration. He didn't have anything to do with the Constitution. But anyway, so Jefferson was a negotiator. He was one of the negotiators with a couple of the Muslim ambassadors during this period in 1785, 86, 87. So he got kind of intimate with this situation. When Washington up there was president, he was spending, in his last year, he spent 16% of the federal budget paying ransom to get these sailors back. That's how bad it was. He couldn't fight. He didn't have a navy, didn't have the ability to go in and fight. And he actually said he felt like Christendom looked weak. He lamented the fact that he couldn't go in. He actually said, and destroy them. That's what he wanted to do, but he couldn't do it. Adams gets elected president. Adams in his last year spends 19% of the federal budget paying ransom to these terrorists, was what they were. And so Jefferson gets elected. Jefferson says, not a penny. He said, I'm not paying any ransom. We're going to war. I don't know if any of you guys in here are Marines, but in the Marine Corps hymn it says, to the shores of Tripoli. You know. You're a Marine? All right, you guys know. To the shores of Tripoli. That was the first war on terror. Jefferson sends in the Marines, 7 years armed conflict on the ground before the whole thing's ultimately over a period of 32 years. We got a great peace dividend when it was finally all said and done, but it was because Jefferson, he said, did something different than Washington and Adams. Why? Because he had been studying the Quran, he remembered his negotiations, and he said, this particular group of Muslims believes they have a spiritual reward for killing the infidel. And if they read the Quran that way and that's their perspective, I can't negotiate with it. I have to defeat it. And so Jefferson's view was there's no defense on this. We have to go play offense. And that's why Jefferson took a different action than the previous presidents had. Washington probably would have, if based on the writings that he had about this, he probably would have if he had the military means to do it. But Jefferson had the means and the understanding, and he went in. So I just think that's an important perspective for us to remember. Those mark and reprise, those were basically mercenaries because they didn't have the means to go get the sailors sometimes, and so Congress had they said we better have the congressional power to be able to hire mercenaries to go in and take care of getting some of these sailors back. And okay, so let's just move right along here. Last thing, and all the powers in the military, we're not even going to get into. That's not really a controversy, I don't think. If it is, we'll do it on a webinar later. The last one, somebody mentioned it over here when we were talking about loopholes. Might have been, who said necessary and proper? One of you guys did. Necessary and proper. Last loophole that they have in there, and it's the necessary and proper clause. Let's take a look at the actual wording, and then we'll wrap it up. It says, to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper, period. No? Are you sure? It doesn't say to make all laws necessary and proper, period? Oh, what's it say after that? Somebody read it out loud for me, real loud.
For carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or office thereof.
So it doesn't sound like there's a new power there. They didn't open the lid and add a power called anything necessary and proper. No, what did they do? They said, all we're doing is making sure that it's understood to do these things in the bucket with the lid on it. There's some other little things you're going to have to do that are part of that. For instance, right above there, what's it say? They can build forts and magazines, arsenals, all that kind of stuff. If you're going to build a fort, you got to go buy the material to do it, right? You got to hire the guys to do it. That's necessary and proper for the foregoing power. So it's not a new power, but boy, have they abused it. Now they say anything that's necessary and proper, they can go do it. But if we look at the plain language, it changes everything. If we go back to the original intent, it is so clear. It is so easy to understand. The problem is we just got away from civics. It really is all it is. We stopped teaching it. We stopped pounding it in. We stopped studying ourselves. I mean, we figured, hey, I'm out of high school, I'm out of college, I don't need to go read the Constitution. We do. We need to read and study it over and over. Because when this stuff becomes so clear to us, when we take that quick start guide and we realize where to plug stuff in, it's so much easier to choose our leaders, to say no when the leader comes home and says, I mean, if your congressman comes home and says, I got $100,000 for the local library. You can say, wait, where in Article 1, Section 8 do you have the power? Well, I'm promoting the progress of science and useful art. Well, no, there's a comma there, and you educate them on that. Well, I'm taking care of the general welfare. I'm doing it's necessary. No, none of that gives them the power to do it. But we, the people, have to know first. We have to be willing to say no when they offer those kind of things. And I don't know about you, but we didn't read every clause in there in Article 1, Section 8. But I've been doing this for a few years now, and if you'll just scan there and help me out on pages 12, 14, and 16, I'm really struggling. I cannot seem to find, it's got to be in here, I'm sure it's in, I cannot seem to find the Department of Education in here. Does anybody see that? You know what? Where is the FDA in here? Anybody? What about the FTC? Anybody? There's about 14 other departments we could name, right? That aren't in here. We allowed them to open the bucket. We allowed them to make it an unlimited bucket. It's our job to get them back in the proper place, and we can do it. The system works if we'll work it. We can put them back in that proper function. So that's the dues of Congress. Those are the things they're supposed to be doing. Let's rein them in and get them back in their proper place. So I know we've covered a lot of ground. Any of the stuff we've already talked about, we just open it up, let you guys ask some questions.
I have a question. So you're saying the judges are making these laws without us checking them?
Well, they're making them without the proper authority. And what we'll find later when we get into Article 3 is the proper function of the court is not to make law, it's to apply the law, and in rare circumstances, rule of law and constitution. Well, actually, we're going to look at what Alexander Hamilton said about that. He gave us a great solution for how to actually overrule the court. We don't talk about it anymore. We think the court's the final say on the law. Not so, according to the Founding Fathers. We'll talk about what he gave as a solution in the Federalist Papers. Somebody else?
Can I give you some questions from?
Yeah, go ahead. Let's get some questions
from
the
webinar.
webinar.
We got some early ones. This first one is from Sarah Cohran in Michigan.
Michigan. We've got somebody here from Michigan, don't we? Who was it from Michigan? Yeah.
And she asks, with the Declaration of Independence declaring the violations of Great Britain, what do you say to Christians who say we don't need to vote, God is going to put in office whoever he wants?
Great question. A lot of times people of faith will say, hands off. If there's a higher being that's in charge of everything and raises up leaders and puts leaders down, then I don't have to do anything. And so the question from the webinar is, if these guys declared with the Declaration of Independence that Great Britain was so wrong they were willing to take up arms against them, and these were clearly men of faith that shared that view that there was a sovereign being, then why should people of faith today get involved in government at all and try to do what we're talking about, rein in government, put it in its proper place, do our duty? What these guys said, well, in their particular case in declaring independence and actually taking up arms, they believed that was self-defense, that it was just war under just war theory because King George had not only reneged on the agreements but actually fired on the Americans. And so they believed that justified it. But they definitely believed that and I love, there's two of the guys in the first Congress by the last name of Muhlenberg. They were actually pastors that also served in Congress. And one of those guys, John Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg, his argument to his brother initially, because Frederick Augustus didn't want to be involved in the war, he chastised John Peter because John Peter actually took up arms. He called his men to arms from the pulpit and went out and fought, became a major general, and actually reached, I think there was only 15 that reached the rank that he did. Anyway, his brother chastised him and said, you shouldn't be getting involved. And he said, I'm a citizen of heaven, but I am also a citizen of earth, and my freedom is as dear to me as it is to any layman. Shall I then sit still? Heaven forbid it. And he said, it's my duty to fight. And that was something these guys really understood, was the concept of duty. And I think sometimes as people of faith, we want to just step back and say God's going to take care of everything, when actually, regardless of your faith, every major religion in the world I can think of still requires you to take some sort of action at times. It requires you to do your duty. I know in my faith, I'm supposed to do my duty. I'm supposed to act on my faith. Faith without works is dead, right? And these guys absolutely believe that. I have lost count at the number of quotes from the founders that use that word, duty. That's something we kind of lost in our culture, that sense of duty that says you do it whether you win or lose. You do it whether it feels good or not. You do it whether it hurts your own person or your health or your economics or whatever it might be. That sense of duty, I would say to the person with the question, is why we as Christians or whatever faith you are should influence the government. It's your job to influence the culture, because this system that they put in place says we are the government. So we can't sit back and say, oh, I'm supposed to just do whatever my rulers say. No, in our system of government, says we are those rulers. So if we, the people, are the ones in charge, we have to be engaged. Yes, ma'am.
What about Exodus 18:21? That specifies it. You don't have to ask it.
Yeah.
Just let's find out what that says.
That is a great point. Exodus 18:21 actually it specifies it for us, and it gives us the guidelines. I mean, it's a great example of, and it's actually where our founders say they got our Republican form of government. You know, we say we have local, county, state, federal government. Well, it says choose out from among you leaders of tens, 50s, hundreds, thousands. That's the same thing. That's where they got the idea. And then it tells us how to choose them, what kind of folks we're looking for. We're looking for able men such as fear God, men of truth, hating covetousness. So what a wonderful guideline. I actually do a blog on my website at rickgreen.com where I analyze candidates, and I take a poll on my Facebook page to get people to rate candidates on those 4 things. Are they capable of doing the job, capable of getting elected, and capable of doing the job? Are they? Do they fear God? Do they have a biblical worldview? Are they honest? And do they hate covetousness? Meaning, do they not? You know, a lot of people want the job so bad they'll do whatever it takes to stay in office. Or when you get in office, boy, the perks are so nice, you want to keep them, so you do whatever. Do they hate covetousness? So anyway, I think you're exactly right. It's a great command for us, and it's a great guideline for us. And I think it's a good example of saying, hey, you know, as a person of faith, sitting out is not an option. And I would add to that, and I forget where it is, but in the Bible it says to know what to do and do nothing and say nothing is sin in and of itself. In other words, to not act. Where is it? In James. So you know there's a right and wrong, and you know something is needed to help your fellow man, to help your country, and you do nothing? Oh, man, I don't want to be that wicked and slothful servant that buried the talent, right? I want to be the one that's out there enjoying and living that talent. Yes, ma'am, go ahead.
Okay, I have a question. It's on the page 14. It says that Congress has the power to coin money. So Congress has the power to coin money. The states do not have the power to coin money. So where does Congress get the power to authorize the Federal Reserve?
Great question. Okay, so she asked about the coining of money. A couple of points on this. This is on page 14 at the top. It's the first power listed on page 14 for Congress. So we're in the bucket of powers for Congress with the lid on it. We gave them the power to coin money, regulate the value thereof. And also, if you flip over to section 10, we'll see that in our bucket that we talked about, or prohibiting or prohibited by it to the states, things we took away from the states, we said that they could not coin money, emit bills of credit, this is for the states, or make anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debts, which means they could use gold and silver to pay their state debt, but not create their own currency, their own state currency. And there's some debate on that. There's some scholars today that believe that does allow them to do it. I don't think it does, but it is debatable. But that leads to your question, which is if the dues for Congress that we said in Section 8 is to coin money, how does that allow them to do the Federal Reserve? I personally believe, and I'm not a Federal Reserve fan, all right? This is one of those areas I agree with my fellow Texan and Ron Paul on, is that you do need to rein in the Fed or get rid of it. I'm a gold standard guy. I wish we had stayed on the gold standard. I think we don't have honest weights and measures right now. This is a whole nother talk I don't want to get too far off on. But I do think constitutionally that Congress has the power to do these things however they want to do them, if it doesn't prevent them from doing it. So if they have the power to regulate the money, if they contract, if you will, with the Fed to do that, they have the power to do it. I don't like the fact that they're doing it. I think it's wrong, and I think we should get congressmen that are willing to say no, but I don't think constitutionally I can say that they can't do it. It's just like having, when I was a legislator, we have a duty to have prisons and keep, you know, criminals away from people or just for punishment, but we could privatize those prisons. We could hire out somebody else to do it if they could do it better. We're still doing our duty in a way that we think is more efficient. Some economists think the Fed is a more efficient way to do it. I don't personally, but they do. So yeah, I mean, so somebody was saying definitely not, right? But I do think constitutionally they have the power to do it. So we could take it away from them if we want, and I think the move to audit the Fed and show just how abusive they've been is gaining more steam than it's ever had in my lifetime. I think finally we're getting to the point where enough people are concerned that I think now there's some momentum. I think it's going to happen. So great question. Yes?
Okay, this question is from Amy Williams from Texas, and she asks, What did it mean back then being an atheist? I thought Thomas Jefferson was one. Was Ben Franklin one also?
Great question. Oh, wow. So the question from the webinar is, what did it mean back in their day to be an atheist? She thought that Thomas Jefferson was one and asked if Benjamin Franklin was one. This is a long answer to this question. And when we get to the First Amendment tomorrow night, we're going to touch on this a little bit better. And I'm going to give you a lot of history, hopefully, on Jefferson when we get there. Among these guys, I don't believe you could name anyone in here an atheist. All right, the vast majority of them were outspoken Christians. They lived it, talked it, wrote it, spoke it. There's just no denying it. It's not even arguable. There were a handful that were not Christians. I would put Franklin in that category. He was not a Christian. He loved the Christian religion. He wanted to go start a colony with George Whitefield. I mean, he understood from a man of the world that saw different governments and cultures. He understood the influence of Christianity and the positive influence it was in the culture itself. So he promoted it and loved it, but he was not himself, at least from anything that I've read or found, a Christian. He believed in God, so he was definitely not an atheist. You heard his quote that I gave you earlier. I mean, no question, that's a man that believes in the hand of providence. Jefferson is a much more complicated guy, not someone I would call a robust Christian at all. Definitely went through times in his life where he denied basic tenets of Christianity, but other times in his life where he absolutely promoted the entire doctrine of Christianity. So he's a complex guy, not easy to put in one box or another, but never was he a negative on the influence of the Christian faith. Never did he say, I don't want religion in the public square. This perception we have of Jefferson is very wrong from what he actually was. He definitely said bad things about some members of the clergy that, frankly, campaigned really nasty against him. I mean, he had some reasons to say some really bad things about some of those guys. And he wasn't an Orthodox Christian at all, so don't get me wrong, I'm not putting him in that box. But he definitely was not an atheist. And I think you can say the same thing. I've yet to find one of these guys that I could argue was an atheist. When we move on to our next section, we're going to talk about the presidency. We're going to find out what the proper function of the executive is, make sure we've got them in the proper place as well. Thanks for staying with us. We'll catch you on the next section when we open up the presidency.
They wanted us to always remember, the government's use of power without our consent is tyranny.
All right, David, I've never asked you. You heard me talking about how I learned about the First War on
Terror.
I've never asked
exactly.
you if during that radio program, could you tell that I had no idea what you were talking about?
No.
Okay, I was just wondering if I bluffed my way
great.
through that. Yeah, David, go ahead and tell. So seriously, about that First War on Terror, I mean, we learned.
Well, that First War on Terror changed the Founding Fathers' view on a lot of things. Now, one of which was the fact that, hey, we don't negotiate with terrorists and we will take care of them. But this is really where we came to understand something the founders opposed. Because if you look back in the Declaration, one of the things that ticked him off with King George III was he kept a standing army among the people. And so back at the time of the Revolution and for a number of years thereafter, we didn't have forts, we didn't have bases, we didn't have places where we kept troops all the time. Our belief was, anybody dumb enough to come to America, we'll call out the people again, we'll all grab our squirrel guns off the mantelpiece.
That is our army.
That's our army. I mean, we're ready for this
Yeah.
because that's what we had done in the Revolution. So we don't want a standing army because throughout Europe, wherever you had standing armies, they oppressed the people. So there was, and part of the way we took care of that in the Constitution was we made sure the commander-in-chief was civilian, not military. So we have total control of the military, not with military folks, but with civilian folks. And I will go back to part of even a previous president, the second president where there was an actual impeachment proceeding, President Clinton. At the time, they were talking about, what he did in the White House and what he did with sexual relations and all these things to the others, and why he would kick people out of the military for that because the Uniform Code of Military Justice says you cannot fraternize with people, and that means sexual relations. And so, and I stood up and defended him and said, whoa, time out. He is not a military guy. You cannot use military standards on him. He actually is a civilian guy, and you can't use the UMJC with him. And because that's how we separated, that's how we kept the military. So, I was actually defending Clinton.
I was about to say that, but that says something about your integrity because regardless of who it is, you stick with the principles. You apply the principles fairly to everybody.
That's right, and it's got to work across the board that way. So, with that being said, the Founding Fathers did not want a standing military because they'd seen all the abuses. So part of keeping that standing military gone is you put limits on it, and one is you put it under civilian control so you can't have the kind of coups, you can't have the military-led coups, you can't have what happened throughout the Revolution with billeting British troops in American homes, etc.
Yeah.
But what they hadn't thought about was, we'll take care of you if you come here, but how do you protect your citizens that are abroad?
Yeah.
And that's what the first war on terror revealed.
And so that was actually happening, what I guess about 3 or 4 years before they met in Philadelphia for the Constitution.
But at that point, it wasn't a big issue yet. We sent our first 3 diplomats to negotiate, which was Franklin and Jefferson and John Adams. Those 3 went to negotiate with 5 Muslim nations we were having trouble with that were attacking us. And the Muslim nations had a thing that if we see a flag on a ship of one of what they called the Christian nations, there were 9 nations they called Christian nations, America is one of them, we will attack them because we're Muslims and we attack Christians and this is what gets us to heaven, etc. So you have international law that says, wait a minute, certain mile offshore, international waters, you can't mess with anybody's ship in international, all agreed to except by the terrorists. And so what would happen is our guys would go sailing into these areas, sailing the Mediterranean. We would go to Russia where we were a good partner with Russia as far as economic trade went. We would sail all over the Mediterranean and the various coasts and do shipping, and we would send stuff overseas, bring it back, and so all this stuff is going on. And every time these Muslim terrorists see an American flag, they attack the ship. Well, because there is international law, your merchant ships aren't outfitted with guns. They'll have maybe 2 or 3 cannon on them, so if you get in a fog, you can fire the gun off. People hear the cannon, they know there's a ship out there.
But no way to defend.
No way to
against,
defend.
Yeah.
You got a few small cannon, usually 2 or 3, but these Muslim terrorists are coming against them with 64-gun brigs. Now, you put that up against a merchant ship,
no chance.
There's no chance.
Yeah.
So what you do is you capitulate, and at that point, Muslims first were killing the Americans. They said, whoa, wait a minute, got a better deal. Let's ransom them, we'll sell them back. And so we have in this library a number of letters from guys who were captives of the Muslims and wrote back home saying, here's what's happened to us, and et cetera. Here's what they're doing to us. One guy wrote his wife and said, this is probably the last word you'll ever hear from me because of the way they treat us here. You'll probably never. That's all right. I've made peace with Jesus. I'm ready to go. It's a very, very compelling letter. So this is going on. And so what happens is, over that period of time, Muslims took about 1.25 million slaves. And they made these guys slaves. And so not just Americans, these other 8 nations as well.
That's over a period of years.
Over a period of years with 9 nations. And so what they generally would do is say, okay, if you're a sailor on a ship, we'll sell you back to America for $1,500. If you're an officer, you're going to get $4,500 for you. And if you're a captain, we'll get $6,500 for you. So they would sell these crews back to America, and essentially we're financing their war against America. We're giving them all this money, and that's where we started saying, hey, we'll give you $1 million a year and give you 3 ships if you'll just stop attacking us. And that's where, as you mentioned, Jefferson had it. He was not going to put up with that anymore. But it was Washington who first came to that grips that, we never wanted a standing army. We didn't want a permanent navy. But we didn't think about having to defend our people over in other places.
Yeah.
And so by 1795, Washington calls for Congress to appropriate money to build a permanent navy. And John Adams executes that plan. That's why he's called the father of the American Navy. Jefferson gets that. He takes those new ships, loads the Marines on them. They head, as you point out, not from the halls of Montezuma, but to the shores of Tripoli, and the Marines go there. And so the belief was we now have to be able to defend our people anywhere in the world. And this is the first time we get a standing military, but it's still not standing.
But I get what you were saying earlier, though. That's why even though some of these things were starting in 1784, they hadn't escalated to the level that when those guys met in Philadelphia, they would say, actually, we do need a stand. So once they got it, and once Washington proposed that, is that why now even you still have to go back every 2 years because of
that's
the
it. That's the other thing that prevents a standing military. Even though we have a standing military, because after that, with all the Muslim stuff that went through about 1816, that's when we started building base and forts and arsenals and permanent West Point, and we have permanent stuff there. That had not been the policy before. But the other requirement in the Constitution says you have to fund the military from ground zero up every 2 years. In other words, if you don't, it goes away. We're not going to. It's not going to be a permanent institution that goes through.
Yeah.
And so we call that today the National Defense Authorization Act. And so every 2 years, it's a big deal.
Yeah.
Every 2 years, we start with nothing in the military and we fund it. Now, what we're doing is saying, hey, we started building battleships last year. We're going to keep building that, keep funding that. But you have to refund everything every 2 years. And that's the other thing that prevents a standing military.
Yeah.
So you have civilian control. You have to refund every 2 years. But in the meantime, as long as we can do that, then it's not a permanent institution that threatens the liberties of its citizens, and we can go overseas in places and defend Americans, or we're supposed to. We're supposed to go defend Americans, but that all came from the Founding Fathers and the view they had of having no standing army that they had to modify once we started defending Americans overseas.
Yeah, makes sense. All right, so what do we then do if we're going to restore a constitutional republic? We got to start thinking about our duty as citizens and fulfilling that role. There's a lot of areas in the Constitution that speak to what the people are supposed to do, whether it's choosing your leaders, that sort of thing. And we'll get to a lot of those specific duties later. But these guys specifically told us that if you don't do your job, you're going to lose all these liberties. So when people are at home or in their churches or wherever they are studying this, they need to think about it in terms of, this is doing my part to literally save the nation. This is not a small thing. When you're studying the Constitution, you're planning to save the country.
Well, the question was asked, since God's going to do all this, why do we have to get involved?
Yeah.
And there's always that fun story that's out there about the flood that comes, and the guy crawls up on top of his house and he prays, God, deliver me from flood. And, here comes a helicopter. Hey, climb on, we'll get you out of it. No, God's going to send me deliverance. And here comes a guy in a rowboat, and hey, climb in the rowboat. Now God's going to send me. And three of those things, and then finally the waters come and the guy drowns. And he's in heaven and says, God, I prayed that you'd save me. What happened? Well, I sent you a helicopter, I sent you a boat, and you did nothing with it.
Yeah.
And so this notion that because God's in charge, we have to do nothing is absolute heresy from a faith perspective.
Yeah.
Because there is nothing in Scriptures that justifies you sitting on your tail and doing nothing.
He has sent us
He
a
has
great
sent
Declaration of Independence, a great Constitution, a great system.
And even from a religious standpoint, if everybody in the world is going to come to Christ, why do we need missionaries? Why does He give us the Great Commission and say, you guys go do it? I'll just do it from heaven. All of that is pure stupidity. But I love the way the Founding Fathers dealt with this. John Witherspoon, he himself is a minister of the gospel, and these are his original writings, and he deals with this issue. This is the mentality that's been there forever, and so he deals with this. Hey, look, God's in charge of government. Why should we get involved? Now, in our particular case, we're a stewardship government, but I just want to read you some of the logic that he applied here. People say, we don't need to get involved. God's in charge. He says, shall we establish nothing good because we know it can't be eternal? I mean, your house is going to fall over eventually, so why even build one at all? Why live indoors? Because it's going to.
Oh no, wait! I remember this one. Why should I clean my room, Mom? It's going to get dirty.
Yeah, exactly.
Again. Okay,
exactly. That same logic. He says, "Shall we live without government because every constitution has its old age and its period? Because we know that we shall die, shall we take no pains to preserve or lengthen our life?" I'm going to die someday, so I'll never see a doctor in my life. I'll never go see a dentist.
And I'll eat all the junk food I want because I'm
That's
going
right.
to die anyway.
Something's growing there, but I don't care what it is. I'm going to die anyway. We don't think like that any other area in life. Why would we think like that in government? And that's what he says. He says, far from it, sir. It only requires the more watchful attention to settle government upon the best principles and in the wisest manner, that it may last as long as in the nature of things will admit. I mean, it's going to die
I love
eventually.
that phrase too, more watchful attention. That's what we're doing.
Because it is going to someday die, you pay more attention right now because it won't last forever. But you do want to, I'm going to die someday, but I'd rather it be when I'm in the 90s than when in my teens.
Yeah.
So I'm going to do some things too. Same with government. Government is not eternal. It will not be eternal. But wouldn't you rather have a government that lasts over 2 centuries, maybe 3 centuries, maybe 4 centuries, than being like France has had 15 constitutions in the same period of time we've had one?
Yeah.
Or being in South Korea where they've had 6 constitutions since 1948? Or being in Poland, that if you're 90 years old in Poland today, you've lived through 7 revolutions and 7 constitutions.
Wow.
Wouldn't you a whole lot rather have it where well, that means we've got to get involved. And you used the term duty a minute ago in talking about the founders and founders on duty. And that is a term that, from a faith perspective, and that question was asked, well, since God's going to do it, why do we need to do anything? It is interesting that the term duty is something that is specifically addressed in the Bible. Jesus himself, when his disciples were having trouble doing what he was doing, performing the same miracles, they came to him in Luke 17 and said, Lord, increase our faith. I mean, we just can't do. And his answer to them to increase their faith was he told them a whole parallel about learning to do your duty. If you want to be mature, you learn to do your duty. This is a word the Founding Fathers used repeatedly, time and again. Let me just give you some of their quotes on duty. Here's Sam Adams. Sam Adams says, the man who is conscientiously doing his duty, and by the way, the easiest way to define duty is that which you ought to do, whether you feel like it, want to, or anything else. Doing your duty is doing the right thing, whether it's convenient, whether it's easy, whether you want to, it's just doing the right thing, period. So he said, the man who is conscientiously doing his duty, that is doing the right thing, will ever be protected by that righteous and all-powerful being, and when he's finished his work, he'll receive an ample reward. In other words, God's given you a country. he said, you're the stewards over this country. You guys take care of it till I get back. Luke 19:13 says, occupy till I come. So do it. Do what you're supposed to. And if you do your duty, if you're conscientious in doing what you can do to make this thing last as long as it can, then he says, when you finish your work, you'll receive an ample reward. And that is what we know out of passages, particularly in Luke and Matthew, where the servants are called before the master. He said, I gave you trust. What'd you do with it? And they said, we didn't do nothing with it. He said, you're in serious trouble. We've been given a country, and if we decide we're going to check out, we're in trouble. Here's another founding father.
We've been given those principles.
We've been given those principles. John Hancock, he says, and having secured the approval of our hearts by a faithful and unwearied discharge of our duty to our country, and this is interesting, he says, if you'll do what's right, your heart will approve it. Your heart will say, you know, nobody else bought into that. You lost the election, but you did the right thing. And so your conscience says you did everything you could. He says, and having secured the approval of our hearts by faithful and unwearied discharge of our duty to our country, he said, let us joyfully leave our concerns in the hands of him who raises up and pulls down the empires and kingdoms of the world as he pleases. In other words, we don't do our duty because it turns out right. God's going to worry about how it turns out. Yeah, every constitution eventually going to die, but that's all right. I tried to keep it tried to keep it alive as long as I could, and we're going to let God worry about when it all dies. And so that's our part. We do that. Here's another good quote from John Jay. John Jay, author of the Federalist Papers, the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. He said, all that the best men can do is to persevere in doing their duty to their country and leave the consequences to him who made it their duty. You just do what's right. God will worry about how it works out. He says, be neither elated by success, however great, nor discouraged by disappointment, however frequent and mortifying.
Well, we need to hear that right there.
That's it.
Whether the election goes great or the election goes terrible, we still keep on keeping on.
You know, what we've said for a long time, I've been involved in politics a long time, you have too, is, you know, the problem with conservatives is if they lose an election, they'll pick up their ball and go home. But the problem with conservatives is if they win an election, they'll pick up their ball and go home.
Yeah, they think that's over, that one battle.
We do not, but I love what he said. If you'll do your duty, then you're not going to have the highs and lows. You're not going to be elated by success. You're not going to be disappointed by frequent and mortifying losses.
Back up to the first part of that quote again. So what you started with earlier, a lot of people in the question we got there at Independence Hall is, if God's going to take care of everything anyway, I don't do anything. That's the opposite concept of, we do everything we can.
That's right.
All that the best men can do. We do our duty. We persevere, knowing He is going to, in the end, take care of everything.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, right now, I'm supposed to do everything He's called me to do.
Well, we get rewards and punishments from Him based on what we do, not what everybody else does.
Yeah.
And so if everybody else screws up the nation and it goes under, that's their problem. But I'm not going to be part of that. I'm going to at least get some kudos from Him. Well done, good and faithful servant, because I got in there and tried to do something, as opposed to, you lazy and slothful servant. You did nothing with what I gave you. You know, that's not what I want to hear. And so that's what they understood. One more, and by the way, he said, we must go home to be happy, and our home is not in this world. And that's why people say, oh, you know, God's going to take care of it. I'm heaven bound. Yeah. He says, here we have nothing to do but our duty, and by it to regulate our business and our pleasures. If you're looking to be happy and uninvolved, maybe in heaven, but not here.
Yeah.
Here, you've got to regulate what you do by your duty. And then Witherspoon said it this way. He said, the sum of the whole is that the blessing of God is only to be looked for by those who are not lacking or wanting in the discharge of their own duty. So, all right, God's going to take care of it. I don't know how it's going to turn out. In the meantime, I've got to bust my tail to do everything I can. Every election, and this is, I hope folks will make a commitment on this, that every time the doors are open for an election, you show up.
Yeah.
Because right now, in city elections and school board elections, only 3 to 6% of Americans show up.
3 to 6%.
Yeah, we think every 4 years I'll vote for the president.
3 out of 100.
3 to 6%.
Yeah.
And so all this wacky stuff that's going on local, and people wrongly think we get healthy from the top down. No, you don't. You get healthy from the bottom up. You go take your local school boards, you go take your city councils and your mayor's races and your public utility seats, and from that you create a farm team whereby you start getting good state reps and good state senators who will eventually run for governor and Congress. It takes a while to get healthy from the bottom up.
But it works.
And it works.
And we see it happen. We've seen pockets of this even right now in the current environment.
Absolutely. And so your commitment should be, one duty I will do is I'm going to vote every time there's an election. I'm going to find out about it. It's a constitutional amendment election. I don't know what's on the ballot. I'm going to find out. So do that. But the other thing is read, study, teach, know, defend, and assert. That's our duty to do that. And if we do that, it will make a big difference.
Before we close out, can I see that Witherspoon again? Was it Witherspoon, the quote that you gave earlier? There was a phrase where he was talking about being watchful. What was it? It was...
It only requires
Yeah,
the more
watchful
watchful
attention.
attention.
Okay, that's what watchful attention. So that's what we've got to have more
right.
of in every single area of our
And
government.
he said
local.
because it is going to come to an end someday, we should have the more watchful attention.
Yeah.
So he's admitting the fact that it's not permanent, but that's why we're more diligent and more watchful. And that watchful attention, you're right, that's a
I
great
love
term.
it. Well, there you have it, folks. We're going to have more watchful attention in every area of our government. In our next chapter here in Constitutional Live, we're going to get into the presidency. How can we have more watchful attention to the presidency and make sure it's constitutional? By studying what Article 2 in the Constitution says about it when we come back here on Constitutional Live with David Barton and Rick Green.